right, what's going on, adventurers? Hope everybody is well. Man, we are just a couple days after Christmas here, and it is crazy how fast this year has flown by. So I remember when we were in the summer talking about long-range shooting and kind of prep for fall hunting seasons. Then I shot the last of my long-range matches because it was time to get into those fall hunting seasons. Went on an elk hunt, was unsuccessful. Dove season came and went. Deer season came and ends this weekend. It's about done. I got some does down, but did not shoot a good buck this year. So I've been so focused on hunting, there has been some other stuff going on in the firearms world, a lot of political stuff, and then some stuff that's really not political, or at least the politics have been decided for the meantime, and it's more just about legislation and new gun laws. And this is important to talk about, and especially for people here with me in the Lone Star State, in the great state of Texas. It's funny, so many people think that Texas, they just imagine rifles and cattle drives and this old cowboy culture. And so many people assume that Texas has always been very lax in terms of firearm legislation and that kind of anything goes, or it's pretty liberal, not in a left-leaning liberal sense, but liberal as in allows a lot of things sense of firearm laws. And I would say historically that has not always been the case. Now, for people living in Texas, Texas is huge on private property rights. There are so many instances where as long as you're on your own property or you're somewhere where you have permission to be, there are a lot of things you can do legally that you cannot do in public. And the carry of weapons fell into that category for a very long time. And it's gradually opened up more and more, starting with the concealed handgun license program, then opened up to open carry, and now the topic of unlicensed carry. And I think in the history of the state, Texas was very heavy-handed in the way they managed these programs. Originally, it was an 8-hour course, and then there was another course to renew it. The license fee was $140, making it one of the most expensive in the country, but that is now decreased to only $40. And the current trend is the expansion of unlicensed carry, or what some people call constitutional carry, throughout the country, especially in the reddest of states. Now, I have a little bit of a problem with the term constitutional carry. I love it as a concept, but I have a problem with it when people use it to describe legislation, because the whole idea of constitutional carry, there are in fact a few states like this where they don't have a carry license or they don't have a required carry program for their residents in order to carry. They basically say if you can legally own a firearm, you can carry said firearm. That would be my definition of constitutional carry, that the Constitution gives me the right to keep and bear arms. I don't need any other permit to be able to do that. I already have that right. It's granted by the Constitution, or if you've watched my video, the Second Amendment doesn't give you the right to own guns. I think you should watch that if you haven't. It's one of my older, cheesier, hokier videos, but I think the point is very solid. The Constitution does not give you that right. It, in fact, protects the right that is already established to exist. Anyway, that's my rant on constitutional carry. I think what most states, in fact, are doing is just having an unlicensed carry program, where if you can legally own a firearm and you're in certain places where you have a right to be, you can carry the firearm, concealed or open, depending on the state, without a license. It's a little bit confusing because many of these states also have license programs. So they have a license that allows you to carry, and the number one reason they have that is for state-by-state reciprocity. Many states recognize the licenses of other states, just like your driver's license is recognized in your state, but also when you travel to a neighboring state. Many states also recognize the handgun licenses of other states. So that's the primary reason why a lot of these states are keeping their programs while also moving to unlicensed carry. So Texas is finally catching up. This year, Texas passed an unlicensed carry bill, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm late to the game, admittedly. This passed in the spring and then didn't go into effect until September 1st. There are a lot of programs like that in Texas where they pass them in the spring legislature, and then September 1st is kind of the go one date. I don't know why that date, but historically it's very, very common. Maybe it has something to do with public schools or just when things are easily implemented, giving people enough time to understand the bills passed in the spring. I don't know, but this went into effect September 1st. So I wanted to wait a little while just because before it went into effect, there was a lot of misinformation. I remember the last big change in Texas was the allowance of open carry with a license, not even unlicensed. And there was just so much misinformation. News articles were saying it's going to be Wild West. There's going to be shootings in the streets. There were just so many fear-mongering articles that were proven drastically incorrect. It's rare to even see somebody carrying openly in the state of Texas. I'm sure I do it far more than most people in the state of Texas, and it's rare for me. I concealed carry significantly, not all the time, but the vast majority of the time. I open carry a little bit, but it's rare to see somebody open carrying. And I don't think there have been any statistics saying crime rate increased. I know there's a lot of people who are extremely pro-gun who would say, hey, concealed carry and open carry, that's going to cause a decrease in crime rate. I don't know that you can make that argument either. I think individuals are going to feel more protected. Individuals are going to be able to better defend themselves. But across the board, I don't know that we have enough data to say that it makes any change to crime rate. But if it helps protect individuals, that is generally a good thing. But I wanted to wait till after this went into effect because there was a lot of misinformation before it went into effect. There were a lot of things that were a little bit weird with this bill. And I wanted to kind of see how licensed to carry instructors kind of wrap their heads around this, how they taught it, how the state kind of reacted to some of these things, how some government agencies reacted to these things. And I think we now have enough information to be able to talk about that and look at unlicensed carry in Texas and what it means, and should you still get your license if you're on the fence. So let's start with a brief history. So 1996. That was the first year that the Texas concealed handgun license went into effect. Before then, there was no formal program. You could keep a gun in your home, but you couldn't carry it out in public. You couldn't carry it on your person. That was the first time there was actually a program where individuals could be licensed to carry a firearm on their person. And to me, it's wild to think that that was less than 30 years ago, that this whole trend of concealed carry, you look at how big the concealed carry industry is and how pro-gun people generally regard Texas and Texans to be, and that this program is less than 30 years old, that's pretty mind-blowing. So it went from 1996 over a full decade before the next huge change, which was concealed carry was allowed in your vehicle without a license. And some listeners may know that Texas does not have a duty to retreat like some states do. If you are in a place where you have a right to be, you can defend yourself in that place. And a lot of times this is wrapped up or described kind of in coordination with the castle doctrine, that your home is your castle and you have a right to be there and you have a right to defend it and protect yourself in your castle. And in 2007, it was decided that your vehicle is not the same as if you were walking about on the street. Your vehicle is an extension of your home, and therefore it falls under the same general principles under which the castle doctrine is interpreted. So your car is just like your home. So if you can have a weapon to defend your home, you can have a weapon to defend your car. And in Texas, long guns have never been legislated in terms of carry regulation. And that's what I think is really interesting. You've always been able to strap a rifle on your back and walk down the street. But strapping a .380 on your hip was illegal unless you were licensed starting in 1996. Before then, it was straight up illegal unless you're on your own property. So what's interesting is in 2007, when this passed, it followed under the spirit of a lot of the current gun laws. So if you have a rifle or a shotgun, or a long gun, as Texas calls it, then it is not required to be hidden. It is not required to be in a case. It's not required to be unloaded. Generally, I recommend you never have a round in the chamber in a vehicle while the vehicle is in motion. I think that's just generally a bad idea. Things can bounce. You can hit a hard bump. Things that wouldn't happen when you're just out and about walking around, but may happen in a vehicle. In Texas, a loaded gun and an unloaded gun are legally no different. And so with long guns, there is no rule on that. They're not required to be hidden. If you have a gun rack, either in the back of your truck or up high in the ceiling, totally fine, perfectly legal. They're not as common anymore just because we see firearm theft increasing and we see a lot of nonviolent crime and theft increasing in general. But the spirit of this rule in 2007 kind of took into account the history of long guns versus the newer legislation with handguns. So long guns can be in plain view, whereas handguns could be in your vehicle as long as they were concealed. And generally, this isn't stated in the law, but generally not on your person. Because if it's on your person, okay, you're now carrying the gun rather than it being a gun in your vehicle. So a lot of times that means in the glove compartment, in the console, in one of those maybe side compartments, somewhere where it's in your vehicle where it is not in plain view. If you can look through the window and see it, it is illegal. Now, there are a lot of people who use those magnet holsters, which I personally don't endorse, or would stick a firearm in a soft leather holster in a cup holder and then throw a baseball hat over it. Technically, it's legal. It's probably not the best option, but it's totally legal. So that happened in 2007, where you could now bring a handgun with you in your vehicle, even if you didn't have a carry license. So there were some small changes in the next couple of years, but nothing notable until 2016. And in 2015, that's when I was personally doing a lot of work with Open Carry Texas. And Open Carry Texas, in general, their mission was to increase gun rights across the state of Texas, most specifically allow the open carry of handguns. And one of their largest protests was people very commonly in major cities all over the state carrying long guns on their back, making the statement, hey, I can carry an AR-15. I can carry a bolt-action hunting rifle. I can carry my 870 Wingmaster on my back and walk down the street, but I cannot legally carry my 380 pistol, my 9mm. I can't carry my Glock on my hip legally, yet I can carry an AK. That's kind of ridiculous, and we need to fix that. So, of course, that was met with some anti-gun people saying, hey, you shouldn't be able to carry any of this. But, of course, that wasn't going to fly in Texas. We're strong enough in the gun rights that eventually open carry ended up working its way into the licensing program in Texas. So, interesting fact, the original bill in 2015 that Open Carry Texas and other nonprofit groups, gun rights advocacy groups, were really fighting for was to keep the concealed handgun license, but then allow open carry without a license. And it was really interesting because at the time there were many other states like this. It's kind of weird logically because if you're concealing it where nobody sees it ever, you need a license. But if it's open to the public where people are actually going to observe it, you don't need a license. And I think the reason this existed was constitutionally, a lot of people said, well, you have to have some way, if you truly in fact believe we have the right to keep and bear arms, you need some legal way to carry that gun without requiring a government permit, without requiring a license. Because I take a very libertarian approach to this, and any permit, any license is the government basically using force to take a right away from you and then sell it back to you. And so the argument for one of these two options being without a license, without a permit, is you still have a way to do it, but there's still a license and some regulation on, in this case, concealed carry, the more common option. And there were several anti-gun groups that really did not like this. They did not like the idea of people carrying a handgun openly without any sort of license or permit. But what's interesting is there were actually some traditional gun groups that also fought very heartily against this bill, namely the TSRA, the Texas State Rifle Association, which is backed almost entirely by the NRA, the National Rifle Association. Now, why would the NRA fight against opening up licensing, opening up gun regulations? Isn't the NRA supposed to be fighting for our gun rights? Well, it turns out that most of the concealed handgun license instructors in Texas are actually teaching NRA certified courses and are licensed, endorsed, and promoted by the National Rifle Association. And so there was a fear from many of these instructors that, hey, if you allow a way for people to carry without needing a license, that's going to hurt sales. We're not going to sell near as many permits because people are going to open carry instead of concealed carry. So it's interesting to look at one of the oldest professional associations in the country, and definitely the largest in terms of firearms, actively fought against what most people in the gun community regarded as an extremely pro-gun bill. But after all that, it still happened. It still went into effect, but it was through the licensing system. So essentially what happened is everywhere the word concealed was used, or any line that mentioned printing or the handgun could not be in plain view, anything like that, was simply marked through, and the name of the Concealed Handgun License Program was changed to the License to Carry Program. So individuals with this new LTC could now carry open or concealed. And this wasn't just related to the actual physical printing of the card. Anybody who still had the CHL had the same rights. Their card was just named something different. I think since this happened in 2016, pretty much all the concealed handgun license cards have now expired. If yours says concealed handgun license on the top, you probably want to check it out, because odds are it's probably expired and you need to renew anyway. But anybody with that or the LTC could now carry open or concealed, with a few particular restrictions. The next major weapons change in Texas was in 2019, when brass knuckles, batons, and other weapons were legalized. I think before this, it was illegal to carry a double-edged knife in Texas. So 2019 was an important complement to some of the firearms legislation that had been passed, updating some of the weapon laws that were specifically non-firearm weapons. And then the next one was what we're going to continue talking about, 2021. So unlicensed carry was passed in the spring, and then it went into effect on September 1st. So as I mentioned previously, the concealed handgun license changed to the license to carry, and the State of Texas Unlicensed Carry Act of 2021 reflected a similar sentiment, that this applies to both open carry and concealed carry. So no longer does it really matter if you're carrying without a license, whether it's open or concealed. Legally, it's kind of all the same. Unless you have a license, then it still changes a little bit based on some signage and some pre-existing laws. So now that the requirement to have a license is not absolute, who can carry without a license? Generally, it's individuals 21 years of age or older, and individuals who can legally possess a firearm. So that 21 years of age or older, that's actually what's required to purchase a pistol. It's interesting, in Texas, you can own a pistol if you're 18. You just can't carry it, and you couldn't purchase one in a store. I think this is really interesting, and there actually are some bills federally that are challenging this a little bit, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But this bill was kind of written with the idea in mind of, if you can legally purchase a handgun, there is now a legal way for you to carry said handgun. What I want to stress throughout all this is that licensing isn't the full picture. So having a license or not having a license is just kind of the baseline to can I carry. There are still so many other laws in so many sections of government code in the state of Texas relating to how and where and who can carry a firearm. It's not just about the license. People make it sound like, oh, if you have a license, you're good. There's no other rules. Or, oh, okay, there's no license. Okay, people can just carry. There are still a lot of other laws that people need to be aware of. And we haven't heard widespread news of it yet, but I guarantee you there are going to be some people getting in trouble, maybe arrested, because they just heard, oh, I don't need a license. And then they walked into some place where they thought they could carry, and they didn't know the rest of the law, and they got themselves in trouble. So with that, who cannot carry? So individuals who are currently prohibited from possessing a firearm under state and federal law will not gain the right to possess or carry a firearm under the new law. So if you already, for some reason, were barred from owning a firearm or possessing a firearm, This doesn't change anything. This doesn't now give you that ability. So some examples: individuals who are convicted of a felony, individuals convicted of an assault-related misdemeanor, or a family violence-related misdemeanor, certain protective order-related offenses, or individuals who are classified as mentally incompetent. So basically, you've been institutionalized, or a judge has declared you're mentally incompetent, you cannot own a firearm. On a Form 4473, these are generally people who are considered prohibited persons. And if you're not aware, the 4473 is the form you fill out anytime you purchase a firearm in a store. So again, if you can't fill out that form and buy a firearm legally over the counter through that form, then you can't carry under the unlicensed carry law in Texas. So with this, if you're not one of those prohibited persons and you are 21 or older and can legally own or possess a firearm, where can I carry? This is where I think there's probably the most issue or the most misunderstanding. People just not understanding some of the prohibited facilities or places. So with this, like I said, licensing is not the full story. The government can and does regulate certain areas where you can and cannot carry. So the places of where you cannot carry a handgun under the current law does not actually change. So these are places, if you took the LTC class, you learned all about these. You learned about all these no-go places where you can't carry a handgun. That now just applies to people who don't have a license as well. You don't gain additional rights by carrying without a license. So I'm not going to get into the full list here just because I don't want to just go on forever with this podcast. But some of the places where you cannot carry are inside schools, inside bars, inside most hospitals and nursing homes. Now that's related to signage a little bit. In any professional or school-related sporting event, at any dog or horse racetrack, and within 1,000 feet of an execution. Two more that seem a little bit more obvious would be within any courthouse or any polling place on an election day. And that one is actually a little bit tricky because a lot of these polling places are public facilities where normally you can carry just fine legally with or without a license now, but on an election day, it now becomes a crime to carry in those places. So that's just a list of a few of the places where you absolutely cannot carry with or without a license. Now, there is also precedent set where private property owners have some procedures where they can prohibit carry on their property. And again, this is generally related to businesses that are open to the public. So we'll go through some of those signs. This may be a little bit difficult to convey in an audio-only format, so I'll try to do the best I can. But a lot of these signs you've seen before, you just haven't probably known what to call them, or maybe you've just seen them out of the corner of your eye and you didn't stop to read the whole thing. But the first one that I want to talk about is what a lot of people in the gun community call the gun buster. So it looks like the no smoking sign or the Ghostbuster sign, the red circle with a line through it, marking out a firearm, usually a 1911 or a Beretta from what I've seen. But this sign is really interesting. It's something that's sold very commonly as a sticker. Sometimes you'll see it with no weapons or no guns. You'll see some other text with it. But licensed carriers have been able to walk past this for years. Legally, it doesn't mean anything. But what's really interesting about the unlicensed carry bill is it ultimately kind of falls apart under criminal trespass laws. In Texas, that's 30.05. And so criminal trespass basically just means if you're on private property and I ask you to leave my property, you have to leave. This isn't a gun statute. It can be for anything. It can be, this is a nice restaurant and you aren't following my dress code that I've established, and so therefore I ask you to leave. It can be, I put up a sign in front of my business that says you have to wear a mask. We see that a lot with all this COVID stuff. And if you're not doing that, no, I can't require you to wear a mask, but I can ask you to leave. And if you do not, you can be cited for criminal trespass. So this is where the gun buster gets really interesting, because a lot of people interpret this as written notice. And I don't think this has ever come up where it's formally been challenged by law. I don't think there's any case that has really looked into this deeply, because with the license to carry, it didn't really matter. This was not a legal sign, but it did kind of tell you the sentiment of the owner of the establishment or the proprietor of the establishment. If you saw this, it probably was not an extremely pro-gun place, was probably not a gun-friendly owner. If you were open carrying in there, maybe they would come to talk to you. If you were concealed carrying in that facility, they'd probably never know. But legally, the sign didn't mean anything. Now with unlicensed carry, it gets interesting because this sign may count as written notice. And I think that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. If you see it, if it's obvious that you've seen it and you chose to ignore it, I could see individuals being cited for criminal trespass. This is very similar to if you see a sign that says no dogs and you walk in there with a dog, or you see a sign that says no shoes, no shirt, no service, and you walk in there shirtless and barefoot, and then they say, nope, you got to get out, and then they cite you for criminal trespass. I could see this being very similar, but it's really interesting in that this is not a firearm-related law. This is just generic criminal trespass. So generally that's regarded as I have to ask you to leave. If you refuse to leave, then I call the cops. They cite you for criminal trespass, which is a misdemeanor in the state of Texas. So again, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. There are a lot of licensed to carry instructors and other firearm instructors that are basically telling people that now that there's unlicensed carry options, this sign now is meaningful, that it is illegal to walk past this sign. And I don't think that's quite true. Now, I'm not an attorney. I'm not analyzing this. I'm just telling you kind of my general thoughts. I'm not giving any legal advice in this episode, but I think if you're going to be cautious and conservative, heed that sign. At a minimum, it tells you the sentiment of the owner. Now, if you're carrying with an LTC and you see one of these gun buster signs or something that just has no guns, no weapons, well, you can just chuckle and walk on your merry way because this doesn't apply to you. There's also a new sign that cites Section 30.05. So this sign just says, notice, firearms prohibited, pursuant to Section 30.05 Penal Code, and then parentheses, criminal trespass. A person may not enter this property with a firearm. I think this sign is also a little bit confusing and is probably going to be fixed in the future because it just says a person may not enter this property with a firearm. It doesn't specify handgun. It doesn't say anything about licensed or unlicensed, but this is the 30.05. So this sign definitely does serve as sufficient written notice. So if you see something like this that says 30.05 and anything about a firearm, that means don't carry unlicensed there because they are effectively giving you written notice. This is the same as the owner walking up to you and saying, you must leave because you're carrying a firearm. Again, it's not at its core a gun law. It is the criminal trespass statute, but this is effective written notice. So again, if you're an LTC holder, just chuckle to yourself and say, well, guess what? That doesn't apply to me. Now, there may be some places that heard about unlicensed carry, put this sign up, and they don't know about any of the previous signs. We've seen so many people moving to Texas from California and other states that are not quite as pro-gun as Texas, that they may not know the history. They may not know about other signs, other laws, and so they think this one sign, especially says, because it says a person may not enter this property with a firearm, they may think that's a catch-all, but it's not. This sign is just for unlicensed carry. The next sign is good old Section 30.06. So this is the oldest and kind of the OG gun sign in Texas. Anybody who took their concealed handgun license course or the LTC knows all about this sign. So it will say 30.06 on it. And when in doubt, just read the dang sign. So pursuant to Section 30.06 Penal Code, trespass by a license holder with a concealed handgun, a person licensed under Subchapter H, Chapter 411 Government Code, parentheses, handgun licensing law, may not enter this property with a concealed handgun. Now, this sign is required to be in 1-inch letters in English and in Spanish. And it is also required to be posted at every entrance to the property. So if you don't see it on the door you walk in, technically it's not binding. Now, a lot of people are going to put it on the front door, on the main door, and if you walk in a side door, they're still going to say it applies. So be responsible. Don't be a jerk. If you see it, you know the intent. But it just means they're probably going to just kick you out and criminal trespass you anyway. So 30.06, simple enough. Concealed carry is not allowed with or without a license. So that's just the most blatant catch-all. If you see that, you better not be carrying a gun in that establishment. And the next sign is the brother of the 30.6. It is the 30.7. Not as fun in that it doesn't relate to a rifle caliber, but makes logical sense that it comes right after 30.6. So this went into effect in 2016 when open carry became a thing. There were a lot of people saying, I was fine with concealed carry. I didn't see it. I didn't mind it. You know, if somebody's carrying a gun, we don't see it. In fact, I feel safer because I know that somebody here is hopefully going to help protect me or protect the place if something happens. But it kind of disturbs my anti-gun customers, so I don't really want to see it. So 30.7 came into effect when people realized we want a way to legally prohibit open carry without interfering with concealed carry. And again, it's the same license, so it doesn't change anything about the individual. Me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of this because the difference between open carry and concealed carry is ultimately it's a dress code law. It doesn't change the place where you're carrying. It doesn't change what weapon you're carrying. And it absolutely doesn't change the intent or character of the person carrying the weapon. It just determines how you wear your shirt or your jacket that day. And I, as a somewhat libertarian-minded individual, the idea of any law in the books that is especially related to weapons that's essentially a dress code law, not super cool with it, but I understand it. I understand that there are people who wanted a way to prohibit open carry. They don't want to see it, but they don't want to absolutely ban carry in their facility. So very similar to 30.6. So pursuant to section 30.07 Penal Code, parentheses, trespass by a license holder with an openly carried handgun, close parentheses, a person licensed under subchapter H, chapter 411 Government Code, parentheses, handgun licensing law, may not enter this property with a handgun that is carried openly. Again, this is 1-inch letters in English and in Spanish. Has to be bilingual. We're in Texas, so makes sense. A lot of times you will see this sign directly next to a 30.6. That effectively means no concealed carry, no open carry. A lot of times you'll just see the 30.7 by itself. That just means, yeah, if we don't see it, doesn't matter, but we don't want to see a handgun on you. No open carry allowed. It would be very strange, and I have not personally seen it, to see a 30.6 sign without an 0.7. If you saw that, it would technically mean that concealed carry is prohibited, but open carry is legal. So I guess you got to do a goofy shirt tuck and show off your gun so that you can now abide by the law. Again, I've never seen that. It would be a very strange combination, and most likely it's just an issue of somebody mixing up this very confusing signage. So when in doubt, just read the sign because it tells you what it prohibits. The 30.5 is a little bit confusing because it doesn't say anything about a license holder, and so just be looking for whether it's talking about a license or not. So I'm sure people are going to mix and match these signs. You're going to see an 0.7 with an 0.5 and no 0.6, which means, okay, you can't carry without a license and you can't carry openly, but if you are licensed and concealed, go ahead. You may even see an 0.5 and an 0.6, but not an 0.7. There are going to be some weird combinations out there. This is so new that I'm just not seeing a lot of new stuff, but it's starting to go into effect, and we're going to see more and more of it, I think. So the next sign that's critically important is actually from the TABC, the Texas Alcoholic Beverages Commission. So this sign prohibits open carry or concealed carry of handguns, typically found in bars and clubs. So this sign is given to anybody who makes 51% or more of their sales from alcohol sold for consumption on premise. That last part, some people just say alcohol sales. sold for consumption on premise is actually really important, because there's a liquor store near me that I conceal carry in all the time, totally legally, because they're not selling it to consume on the premise. That's the difference legally between a bar and a liquor store. And so if you see 51% on any sign, and a lot of times these are a little bit tricky in terms of where they're displayed, because they're actually coming from a different section of Texas law. So all the concealed handgun licensing, license carrier laws, that was, I think it was section 411, that describes all these signs and how they're supposed to be posted. This comes from when a business gets its liquor license. There's other rules that come along with it saying, okay, this is how you have to document your sales. This is what you can do. You can't sell to minors. And, oh, by the way, you have to have this sign. And a lot of people don't like putting this sign in a super obvious place on the outside of their building, because it literally says felony notice on the headline. And so a lot of people don't want a big red felony notice sign on the front of their door. So sometimes you got to walk in, look around. You'll see this sometimes on the mirror behind the bar, sometimes on the counter itself, sometimes just on a pillar somewhere. Look for this sign, and if you see it, definitely heed this sign. Now, important thing to note, the whole consumption on premise thing, that's not any place that serves alcohol. It has to be 51%, over half of their sales come from alcohol. And in Texas, it is not illegal to drink and carry a firearm. Let me say that again. It is not illegal to drink and carry a firearm. It is, however, very illegal to be intoxicated and carry a firearm. And a lot of people, when they think of intoxication, they think of, blood alcohol content or blood alcohol concentration of 0.08. No. That is one of the requirements to be intoxicated, but it is also the loss of mental capacities or physical capacities. Basically, if mentally you are unable to control yourself, or physically you're unable to control yourself, then you are intoxicated. 0.08 is just one other way somebody can be ruled to be intoxicated. Think of a field sobriety test. You can fail a field sobriety test where they ask you to, recite the alphabet backwards, or do some crazy acrobatics where you're standing on one leg, or you're trying to walk a line balancing. They don't know your blood alcohol concentration when they're doing that. They're testing for basically physical or mental competency when they're doing that. So it is illegal to be intoxicated. But in terms of, is it a crime to be in a certain building with certain alcohol sales, it has to have this 51% sign. Now, the next sign that just absolutely drove me crazy was another TABC sign. And the TABC, it's almost like they want to be a little mini Texas version of the ATF. They have so many regulations, and a lot of times they're written very differently than the rest of Texas law. And so this next sign, I call a blue notice, because oftentimes the word notice is in blue. So see how I'm being super clever with the name? Not really. But I don't think the color is part of it. I think that's just the most common thing they print. And again, the TABC prints and issues this sign to places. This sign says, notice, the unlicensed possession of a weapon on these premises is a felony with a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment and a fine not to exceed $10,000. Now, that sounds like a very scary sign. I see the word felony. I see the word imprisonment. I see the number $10,000. And what stands out to me is this also says the unlicensed possession of a weapon. So again, we're not talking about handguns. It's talking about a weapon. It's not talking about licensed. It's talking about unlicensed. And possession. So it's not talking about a manner in which it's carried. It's just if you possess it. So this sign kind of is a scary blanket. If you have a weapon in here, boom, you're a felon, is what it sounds like. What's really interesting, this sign, when we were fighting for open carry in 2015, there were a couple people who they attempted to charge under this sign while they were carrying a long gun. I I believe it was in a Walmart, and they basically said, hey, you are possessing a weapon within this premises, and it's an unlicensed weapon. But that gets really interesting because there's never been a license for a long gun. It's never been required. It's not even a thing. Even if you wanted to get one, you could not. So that's where this got really interesting. And then they realized, okay, weapon, what does that mean? Is that any knife, any gun? And I don't know if there was actually case law on this, but in terms of what I heard of being enforced, they pretty much determined that this was just a handgun, and unlicensed was purely to exempt it from the licensing group of laws, so the CHL or LTC. And this sign, we've all seen it. Even if you don't think you've seen this. If you've been into a Walmart, you've seen this. If you've been into a gas station, you've probably seen this sign. Again, it's not like the 30.6 or 30.7 sign that's required to be 1-inch high letters, English and Spanish. A lot of times it's just tucked away behind a counter, on a door, on a glass window somewhere. But this goes to any place that sells alcohol not for consumption on premise. So that liquor store I mentioned earlier, you'll see this sign. Any place that sells beer or wine, you'll see this sign. So the unlicensed possession of a weapon is a felony in any place that sells alcohol. So this gets really interesting and seems to directly fly in the face of the fact that Texas now allows unlicensed carry of a handgun, supposedly. So I actually called TABC personally and asked about this, and they said they are no longer issuing this sign and it will no longer be enforced. Now, this is probably the most common sign in terms of you go into a Walgreens, you go into a 7-Eleven, you go into a Walmart, you're going to see this sign. And because I had to literally call TABC myself and get an explanation, means there are a lot of people who don't know that this sign's no longer being enforced. They don't understand this sign. I think this is going to cause some more confusion in the future. Time will tell. Hopefully people will start pulling them down because they're not going to be enforced, but it's going to cause a lot of confusion. Now, what I think is interesting, remember how I mentioned that gunbuster sign or those generic no-gun signs? How those, even though they're not related to any sort of gun law, they could be used as giving effective notice, saying, hey, no guns here. I'm interested to see if this blue notice, the unlicensed possession of a weapon sign posted by TABC, if that will ever be tried as something that does or does not give sufficient notice. I don't think we're going to know until somebody is literally arrested for it and it goes to a case. And I don't think that's likely. It may happen at some point, but it will probably be a long time. And I think with all these signs, that's the most confusing part of this Texas law. Because individuals who just saw, hey, don't need a license anymore, guess I'm good to go, they're probably not going to know all this stuff unless they just spend hours researching. Because most people learn about these signs through taking the license to carry class. The license to carry class required by the state is not about how to shoot. Yeah, there is a proficiency part of it, but it's a very easy proficiency standard. It does not teach you proper storage of a firearm. Yeah, it mentions some of that stuff. A lot of people think it teaches you how to defend yourself and how to shoot. No. The course is almost exclusively about law, where you can carry, where you cannot carry, and how to go about that legally and responsibly. So from that standpoint, I think that the LTC class is a very good thing. Even though I'm not generally pro-licensing for licensing's sake, I think a lot of really good content is taught in the class, and it took a lot of people who were very knowledgeable about firearms. It created a business and an industry and a methodology of teaching and education. So I'm not going to the store just to buy more ammo and just to buy earplugs and see if that new cool 1911 is in stock. It created a way for people to actually learn about safe and responsible carry through these classes. So education is always a good thing, whether you have a license or not. And that education is designed primarily just to keep you out of trouble so that these laws don't have to be enforced by police, by force, and that there's not as much confusion about where you can and cannot carry. Now that people can carry without a license, again, I don't think it's going to be widespread. I think it's going to be very gradual, but I know some people will get in trouble for carrying in a place they shouldn't just because they didn't learn about those laws. So the whole course, all the education is designed to keep you out of trouble. And so any of those signs, if you violate them, walk past them when you shouldn't, it could get you in trouble. Most of these are misdemeanors. Some of the alcohol-related signs, like if you carry a firearm in a bar, that very well could be a felony. Something else that I think is really important to talk about, especially in Texas. On a previous episode, I had CJ Grisham of Open Carry Texas kind of giving an update on the state of carry laws and just gun laws in Texas. And CJ is an important character in all this because he was arrested for walking down the street with a rifle slung on his back, something that has always been perfectly legal in Texas. And his arrest kind of sparked the fire to a lot of the open carry fight, but it also tapped into something that's been law for a long time, and that's the authority of law enforcement relating to firearms. So a police officer still has the right to disarm an individual if they reasonably believe that it is necessary or they possess a threat to themselves or others during the encounter. The officer is required to return the firearm to the individual if they are not arrested or cleared of violations. An officer absolutely cannot make a pretextual stop if they see somebody carrying a firearm. This has been decided in case law twice, Terry v. Ohio, and I believe Brown versus Texas. So Terry v. Ohio, that became known as a Terry stop. That was, I think it was New York City that had the stop and frisk policy a while back. It was under the Terry stop ruling that they declared, hey, you can't do that. Seeing somebody carrying a gun is a legal activity unless you have a clearly defined and suspected reason why it would be illegal. So you can't stop somebody just for carrying a gun, which is most likely a legal activity. And that's what the whole deal with CJ Grisham was about, and why it was so upsetting is because he was just walking down the street with a long gun, perfectly legal, and an officer disarmed him, and he was stopped because he was carrying a gun. If he was just walking down the street and, I don't know, he was jaywalking and he was stopped for that, the officer legally could have taken his gun just while they were talking and then handed it back to him and said, okay, go on your way. But because he stopped him, citing the cause as, hey, I saw you carrying a gun down the street, that was an issue. Now, I think we all know enough about cops that we know there are enough workarounds, there are enough ways to bend things that they could say, oh, I didn't stop you because you had a gun. I stopped you because you kind of look like this person I saw who I have a warrant for. Let me go back and look in the book. Okay, I saw you for somebody who looks like a wanted person. I saw you for a suspect of a kidnapping or an auto theft. You kind of look like that other guy. That's why I stopped you. I think that's going to happen. We know the truth is going to be bent and manipulated, and officers are going to use that to take advantage of the situation. But I think it's important to know that if the reason they say they are stopping you is because I saw you carrying a gun, it is now an illegal stop. Now, there are so many people who are internet YouTube lawyers who will just get into an argument with a police officer. Sometimes they know the law, sometimes they don't. Usually they're there just because they got a call and they got to check something out and just make sure things aren't getting out of hand. So usually it's with good intentions. It's not with the intentions to violate your rights and mess with you. But we know while they're there, they're allowed to say what they want, and they're going to try to get any information they can. So just be careful and know that. So that applies to carrying with a license or without. None of that changes. Again, this is just in the category of laws that have existed on the Texas book, that the licensing requirement doesn't change. They were laws previously, they still are. So what happens to the license to carry program? Many times in this discussion, I've talked about unlicensed carriers versus licensed carriers. Well, I don't suspect that it's going to go away anytime soon. I think some of these signs can be consolidated. They might be simplified. They might be made a little bit more consistent. But the license to carry program is probably going to stick around for quite a while. And there are some reasons to that. So Texans who want to carry a handgun now have some options. And I realize I said Texans right there, which could be interpreted as residents of Texas, but actually all of this doesn't have anything to do with residency. You do have to be a Texas resident, I believe, to have a Texas LTC. There are some states where you don't have to be a resident of that state to get the license. That may have changed in Texas. I'm pretty sure you have to be a resident to get the LTC, but ultimately unlicensed carry, that is going to apply to anybody in the state of Texas. Doesn't matter if you live in Oklahoma and you just came down south to spend some time in the great state of Texas. You're now in Texas, so Texas laws apply to you. It doesn't matter if you're a resident or not. But anybody in Texas who wants to carry a firearm now has some choices. They can carry under the allowances of the unlicensed carry law, or they can pursue the LTC route. So if you are potentially interested in getting the license to carry, there still are some advantages to the license to carry. So state reciprocity, I mentioned that earlier. Texas has one of the best reciprocity programs. There are tons of states that recognize the Texas license. I think right now it's 38, maybe it's 39. There are so many states that if you have a Texas LTC and you carry in that state, they say, that's just as good as our license. We get it. We know the requirements of Texas. You're good to go. So if you travel a lot and you plan to carry out of state, LTC, I think, immediately becomes a very good decision. Another one that's important to me is no background checks, no NICS checks. That's the National Instant, check system or criminal system. Whatever. It's the FBI background check system that's used and implemented whenever you purchase a firearm. So you fill out that form 4473, and they call it in, or now they can do it on the internet. But you don't have that if you have the Texas LTC, because you already had to have your background check to get the LTC, and so that's sufficient. So if you like buying a lot of firearms, if you have a very common name, if you want to guarantee that when you go to the store to buy a firearm, you're going to walk out with it that day and you're not going to get delayed because your name looks like somebody else's name, the LTC basically means you do not have to have that background check each and every time. So if you buy a lot of guns, I think it's worth it for that alone. It's really interesting, actually. There are a lot of people who are former military or high up in law enforcement or worked for the government who had some sort of secure clearance. And a lot of times those people are the ones who get delayed the most because they have some sort of secure file that the person running the background check can't actually access. So instead of getting that instant approved, they get a delay because they have to escalate it to a supervisor to be able to go through whatever that classified document, that classified file was. Not really related to the LTC itself, but just something interesting about background checks. So the required training in the LTC class can actually be very helpful. I talked a lot about those signs here, but without seeing them, it's going to be kind of tough. Do you remember what the 30.5 sign looks like? Do you remember what the 06 sign looks like? The 07 sign, the 51% sign, the blue notice TABC sign? Do you remember what all those mean? Maybe you do. If you do, you're a rock star. Thanks for paying attention. But they get confusing. And so in the class, you learn about these from a licensed instructor who's usually very good at teaching these signs and teaches all the prohibited places that I just kind of glossed over. And I've still been talking for almost an hour, and I gave you the short version. So the 4-hour training class, it's actually pretty helpful. And there are some signs that prohibit unlicensed carry that don't apply to the LTC holder, like that 30.5 sign I mentioned earlier, like that gunbuster sign. If you see that gunbuster and you have a license to carry, you can just walk right on by it. Doesn't even matter. Law enforcement and others will also know that you've been trained. And so if you get pulled over, it generally looks a lot better. And I don't love this because it's more in the category of appeasement than anything else, but it looks a lot better to hand over your license to carry and then inform the officer, I'm carrying, here's my license. They immediately know that even though you didn't have to, you took a class. Even though you didn't have to, you spent your time and your money to be educated and responsible, and you've passed a background check. Rather than, yep, I'm carrying a firearm, and then they have to figure out, is that legal? Is that not? What are all the situations here? It does look a lot better, and I think those interactions can go quite a bit more smoothly. Again, that's not really an issue of law as much as it's an issue of optics and public perception. So now that we've talked about this, we've talked about a lot of the general requirements that apply to licensed carriers and unlicensed carriers. I talked about some of the advantages of the LTC. There are definitely some advantages to carrying without a license too. I think it further codifies and establishes that yes, in fact, we do have the right to keep and bear arms. I really appreciate it for that aspect alone. You can also save $40 by not getting the license. And this isn't really that $40 is that big of a deal. To me, it's more the issue of I shouldn't have to pay the government for a right that I supposedly already have. So if that's a big deal to you, then carrying without a license, you don't have to pay the government for a right you already have. Again, if you just look at it and you just say, yeah, it's $40, that's worth the reciprocity and those other things, I'm just going to pay it. I totally get that too. But there is a little bit of advantage if you're going to be super fundamental about that. You're also not required to attend a training class. So that's 4 to 5 hours of your time back. That's something sitting in a classroom that you don't have to do. That's some extra expense that you don't have to spend paying for that instructor. Not necessarily an advantage to some because I think the class is really good, but anytime you basically say, hey, here's good education for the sake of good education, rather than for the sake of here's good education because it's required by law, I kind of support that. I think if education's good enough, people will take it, people will want to learn about it, rather than using the force of law to make people take it. And right now, there actually are some places where license holders may be restricted, but people without a license potentially could walk on by. So if you saw a place that did not have the gun buster sign, did not have a no guns generic sign, but did have a 30-06 or 30-07, both of those signs do say by a license holder, which technically, if you have never had a license, those signs don't apply to you. Now, I think if somebody has the 30-06 sign or 30-07 sign up and you walk in open carrying, if you walk in concealed carrying, they're probably never going to know. But if you walk in open carrying, and they don't probably care if you have a license or not. They just thought they were banning gun people, and then they see a gun person walk in. They're probably going to ask you to leave, and if you don't, they're probably going to just criminal trespass you. So that could be an advantage, but I think it's a temporary one. I think people are going to catch on to that. People are going to get wise, and it's going to sort itself out. So there are some advantages to carrying without a license. There are some definite advantages to carrying with a license. And I think one that I didn't mention here in carrying without is just the privacy. Basically saying, yeah, I'm not going to send my fingerprints to the government. I don't want another government permit for something that I should already be able to do. I totally get that as well. So it's a personal decision. There's a lot to take into account. If you just want a firearm for home protection, if you just want it to shoot at the range, you don't need a license for either one of those. In Texas, you don't need to register your firearm. A lot of people are confused about the 4473, thinking that's a registration form. That's more of a transfer form. So that actually gets retained by the shop that sold you the gun. It doesn't go to the ATF unless they get audited or the business closes and nobody buys out the business. That's more just to document the transfer in case they have to ever trace that firearm related to criminal activity. So I know we've talked about a lot. We've talked about a whole bunch of signs. We've talked about places people can and cannot carry. I hope that all this discussion was helpful, and that if you've been on the fence about should I get my LTC, or maybe with this new unlicensed carry law, maybe that's good enough for what I want to do, hopefully this clarified some things for you. Hopefully you learned a lot. Until next time, stay safe, be free, carry on, and never stop seeking adventure.